So before I introduce our guest tonight, I wanted to give a special shout out and a huge thank you to the Bookstore of Glen Ellen. There you are, ladies. Thank you so much for your partnership. You have been wonderful, and they are here tonight with books for sale. So please visit and buy a book. So we are so honored to have Esau McCaulley here with us tonight. Esau McCaulley, PhD, is an author and associate professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. His writing and speaking focus on New Testament theology, African-American biblical interpretation, and Christian public theology. His new memoir, How Far to the Promised Land, questions the narrative of exceptionalism that he and other Black survivors are conditioned to give when they make it in America. Dr. McCaulley's previous book, Reading While Black, African-American Biblical Interpretation as an Exercise in Hope, has won numerous awards, including Christianity Today's Book of the Year. He is also a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. His writings have also appeared in places such as The Atlantic, Washington Post, and Christianity Today. Please join me in welcoming Esau McCaulley. Thank you.
I didn't know who they were talking about. I was like, oh, that's impressive. Oh, it's me.
It's you. Well, thank you all for coming out. My name is Sam. I serve as a pastor at Progressive Chicago, and I have the privilege of conducting an interview with Dr. McCaulley over his book, How Far to the Promised Land. Dr. McCaulley, writing is difficult in and of itself, but writing the story of your life in an honest, a clear, mature way, it makes writing, takes it to a deeper level, makes it even more a complicated task at hand. To just start off the conversation, talk to us a little bit about why this memoir and how did you know you were ready to write this memoir?
I mean, I think, is this on? Can y'all hear me? So the memoir starts off in the preparation of a eulogy. So it starts off with the act of writing.
Yeah.
In 2017, my father died in a single car accident in California. He was a truck driver, and he had dropped off a load in California, and he was coming back to the South where we lived. And we don't know what happened, but he veers off the overpass down into the to the one below, and he's immediately killed. And I got a call from my mom. My sister after it occurred, and we had a conversation. And the next day, I spoke with my mom, and it quickly became clear they wanted me to do the eulogy. Mm-hmm. Now, it's complicated because I didn't know my father very well growing up. He had been in and out of our lives. He had struggled with addiction, with drugs and alcohol. And his departure from our lives sent us tumbling down the economic ladder. And so the request to do the eulogy was almost like doing a eulogy for someone who I didn't know well. Mm. And in a previous life, before I became a professor, I pastored churches. And one of the things you do as pastors, when you do eulogies, you sit down with the family and you ask them, tell us about this person who has died. Tell us about what they were like as children. And so what began as an exploration of his life quickly became a journey into my family history, because I learned stories about my family that I never heard. And in the midst of doing that work, I realized something that it kind of led to was the journey what became this book, is that when you are poor and Black and Southern, all of American history is kind of dumped onto your lap.
Yeah.
One of the things about having money is that money gives you the ability to hide from things. Mm. So if you don't like, the poor, you can kind of go into a gated community. But if you're poor and you're Black and you're Southern, everything that happens in America happens to you. So my family experienced things like tenant farming and economic exploitation. We experienced, Jim Crow segregation. We experienced Brown Race Board of Education. We experienced the war on drugs and the crack epidemic. And so what began as an exploration of my father's and then my family's story really ended up being a story about Black life in America. But more than that, I realized that in the context of trying to make sense of my father's life, I was also trying to make sense of my own and the purposes of God within all of that. Like, where is God in the context of Black life in America? Yeah. Where is God in the context of my own life? And how do you make sense of God in the context of a country that often treats Black people so poorly? Yeah. And so what became How Far to the Promised Land really began when I sat down to write that eulogy in 2017. Mm.
No, that's powerful. One of the greatest things I think I took away from the book is the fact that God does not wait for us to get out of our mess for him to meet us there.
Yeah.
That even in the midst of poverty, in the midst of struggle, in the midst of pain, in the midst of heartache,
Yeah.
it seemed like you almost had I mean, I'm a pastor, so I have to talk for the Bible, forgive me. But you know how Joseph looks at the end of his life
Yeah.
and summarizes it in a way after being mistreated by his family, by being mistreated and lied upon.
Yeah.
He summarizes his life by saying, what you meant for evil, God meant for good.
Yeah.
And I heard echoes of that throughout your story.
Yeah. So there are three kind of traumas or events or themes that run through the core of How Far to the Promised Land. One of them is familial betrayal. Another is anti-Black racism.
Yeah.
And the third is poverty. And one of the things that is at the center, anyone who knows about the Joseph story, Joseph is betrayed by those closest to him, his own brothers.
Yeah.
And Joseph has to make sense of a life where his origin story, where he ends up where he is, happens because the people closest to him, supposed to love him and care for him, turn their back on him. And for me, the issue was my father. You know, what is more idealistic than a father and a son? I tell the story in the book of like this one happy moment that I had. Only one I can remember from my childhood is the first day I went to football practice. He teach you how to get in the stance and you know, run the plays. And you know, I was a husky kid, as they call it. You know, back in the kid, you gotta be sensitive. You gotta call him husky. And so, you know, I didn't get to be a running back. I was immediately a lineman from the day I was born, right? And so I remember all of the parents were standing along the fence watching their kids perform. And that just felt so ordinary. And then after that practice, I go into the backyard with my dad, and not just the lineman stuff, he had me running routes. Like the only time I ever ran routes. Like I never did that in a real football game. But that was almost like what you would see on a television show. Yeah. And I remember that day thinking that was a really ordinary day. But it stands out because of how unique it was. Because one of the things related to addiction is that people can radically change from one to the next. That's right. And so when my father was clean, off drugs, he was funny, gregarious, charming, everybody loved him. When he was on drugs, he could be violent and dangerous and cruel and vindictive. And so that absence is one of the things that marks me. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is that when you are a kid, you don't have anybody else to turn to than your parents. So the very people who wound you are the people who you want to love you. That's right. And so you're both drawn and repulsed at the same time. And that relates to the spiritual question, because you begin to ask questions like, well, what kind of God allows this kind of thing to happen to a young kid? Because I've done nothing wrong to deserve it. And so for me, the spiritual wrestling with like the problem of evil in the context of familial abandonment is similar to Joseph, who got to deal with the question of who God was when his whole life was set in motion by betrayal. And so I think that a lot of people who have tried to make sense of their lives as adults, that we carry these wounds within us, the people who we loved who betrayed us. And I know you asked me about like how when I was ready to tell this story. And in some sense, it's true that I began working on this with the eulogy, but I didn't know that it was ever going to be a book. Sure. But there's this truth that there's these events that happen in our lives. And if I had time and I said, each of you, tell me 10 stories that you can't forget. And all of you could do it. But for a long time, I could say that like our traumas have control of us. Yeah. In other words, we return to those memories, but the pain is still there, and we don't have much to say other than we survived them. Yeah. But sometimes you get to this place in your life where the stories don't have control over you, but you have control over them. So you can bend those stories, not change them, but to use those stories for your own purposes. And I felt like I was ready to write How Far to the Promised Land when those stories weren't just pains, where there were things that I could form into a coherent narrative. And in some sense, writing this narrative was the final act of that process. That now I can talk about it. One of the examples, forgive me, I might not let you answer any more questions. One of the people who I've always looked up to, who I've got, well, not always, I've known her for a few years. Her name's Rachel Hollander. And she is an abuse survivor. Yeah. And not every abuse survivor has to tell their story. Sometimes the testimony is, I survived and I escaped and I got justice. But some abuse survivors use their stories to help other people.
Yes, sir.
And every time they tell that story, they're telling about one of the most difficult events in their lives, but they're using it, right, for the sake of helping others. Yeah. And when I got to the place with those stories that I can use it, people always say, well, how can you write them? Everything in my life ain't in that book, right? Yes. Some stories still have control of me, right? Yeah. And I wasn't ready to tell them, but what's in Half Far to the Promised Land were the stories I felt ready to tell.
No, that's great. Yeah. I think I remember some author one time wrote, I forgot who it was, that if we don't transform our traumas, we'll transfer them onto others. And I think one of the things you did so well in the book is you humanize the people that hurt you.
Yeah.
I remember in a class of mine in seminary, one of our professors told us that no one leaves childhood unwounded. Yeah. And that's also true of those who wound us. Yeah. And you write with such clarity, charity, and grace about your father, about his parents, about your grandparent, your maternal grandparents. So talk to us a little bit about that, the process of that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is influenced by a guy named Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman talks about what anger does. Yeah. And he speaks about how anger, this is a paraphrase, but this is the heart of what he got at. And Jesus in the Disinherited. He said, anger is a good motivating emotion. He may have used the language of hate. It can spur you on to activity because you're angry about it and you want to do something. But he says that hate, once kindled as a fire, tends to burn down more than just the object of its hate. Wow. So if you're angry at someone and that's motivating you, it's hard to turn that anger off and come home and be kind to people. And so that anger, he says, is the fire that can burn up the whole house. And it is true that when I was a child, I hated my father. It's significant portions of my life. And I remember, I'm luckily my early years as a preacher was before the internet, right? So these early sermons, maybe you can find them, but don't go Googling them. No, they weren't there. I was speaking in rooms with no internet. And so I remember that, like, for a long time, my father was the villain, right? And I would talk about, the abuse and the things that happened. And I would say, well, God can help you survive anything. Yeah. That was the way that I told it. And I wanted to be different than him. I wanted to be like a father who was present when, like, my father had been absent. But I realized that, like, that emotion can only take you so far. And what changed in my life is that when I reached adulthood, I'll put it this way. I met people like my father who were at the end of the narrative and not the beginning. And what I mean by that is, if you're a clergy person, you have to say to people, you can start over. Yeah. You can make a mess of your entire life and you can actually begin now to be a better person. Yeah. And I would say that to people. It doesn't matter. And I knew people who had come into my congregation who had broken relationships with their families because of the things they had done. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, this is like super inside baseball, but you'll find it interesting. I was walking out of church, the church that we attend, and the guy who does the traffic parking lot stuff stopped me and was telling me about his story. And I was saying he had been an addict most of his life. Wow. And that he had gotten clean 5 years ago. And now he preaches in the same prison where he used to attend, and the place where he used to get high, he now owns the house and lives there.
I know exactly who you're talking about.
But I think he mentioned the fact that he's estranged from some of his family because of his life of addiction. And so I used to meet people like that all of the time. And I would say, you can start over. But I didn't extend that same graciousness toward my father. And when I said, when I made him, in the process of doing eulogy, this is the first time I'd ever done it in my life, he became the star of the show instead of me. Yeah. And what I mean by that is, I had always seen my father through the lens of the son who has failed, instead of seeing this as a person whose life is defined by addiction and estrangement. And I said, any human being, I wouldn't want their story to end like that. Who wants to know someone who gets addicted to drugs and dies estranged from everyone he's ever known and loved? And so in that perspective, he didn't become a villain, he became a tragic figure. And understanding addiction and understanding something like the idea of grace gave me the space to see him. And maybe this is the other thing that's about this. When you make it like to out of poverty, you grow up where I grow up, and then you come to a nice neighborhood like the one we have here in Wheaton, live right around the corner. There's a sense in which the community that you live in and the school where I teach can pretend like the only thing that is valuable happened once I arrived here. And that the only testimony that I have of my childhood is that I escaped it. But there were people there who were capable of profound acts of kindness and goodness. And they were complicated people, right? They were complicated people. And I wanted to be able to say there was more to my neighborhood than I escaped it. And there was more to my father than he was an addict. People's narratives aren't one thing. And I live in a world where people are always summarizing and dismissing the poor. And I feel like they never see them, right? You see a news clip, you got 35 seconds, you tell these are the 3 things the person did. And they never talk about, and so I wanted to talk about not just my father, but the people in my community that captured both its brokenness and its beauty. And to ask the question, are we comfortable with a country that creates communities that have to bear that kinds of suffering? Because that community that I grew up in was once a white middle-class community. Until it was integrated. And then there was white flight and they left. And because my mom was one of the first, her class was the first ones that integrated the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school. And when she was there, it was majority white. By the time I get to that same school 15, 20, or 20 years later, it's now mostly Black. And all the businesses are gone. Right? And everyone who talked about that part of my neighborhood saw it as nothing but, a bunch of people that you can toss to the side. And I wanted to write a narrative that forced people to see that community.
No, that's incredibly helpful. People are more than the decisions that they make. The worst decisions they make, I think, is a direct line I was trying to find thoroughly.
I remember it.
I'm glad you did. Talk to us a little bit about, it's hard to ask you about a question about the book without asking you a question about your life. What's a episode of your life that you enjoyed working through in your book?
Oh man,
maybe your favorite.
Man, I can't talk about. There's one indulgent part of the book.
Okay. Give us the page number.
No, it's called Fools Fall in Love. It's an entire chapter.
Oh yeah.
A lot of the book chronicles my childhood and the kinds of things that happen in the South. And a lot of it's hard. I'd say the body count is shockingly high. People die in most every chapter. And that part is hard. And a significant, probably someone who's very, very important to me is my wife. I really, really like her. I might even love her. Right? And I wanted to tell the story of how we met. And how we fell in love. And so Fools Fall in Love was the chapter that I said, I'm going to talk about my wife because I can. But it relates thematically. If you read the chapter, you can see why it's in the book and how it relates to the idea of forgiveness and grace. And so it's not just a complete indulgence. As far as something that I think was interesting to write was I really enjoyed some of the things that happened before I was born. There's a chapter called
Sophia's Gift.
Sophia's Gifts.
That's my favorite chapter.
Sophia's Gift. It was actually the first chapter that I wrote in the book.
Oh, really?
The chapter, Sophia's story is the first chapter of anything that I wrote.
Beautiful chapter.
And it tells the story of my great grandmother, Sophia, who was a tenant farmer. And back in those days, they didn't think it was worth their energy to educate a Black woman. And so she was illiterate, but she was a farmer, and she worked the land. And in the evening she picked cotton, and in the evening she would clean the white people's houses. And then after that, she would go on functions as a midwife and bring little Black babies into the world. And she saved up enough money to buy a plot of land.
Yeah.
And if you could thinking about how unimaginable that is as an act,
Yeah.
it was glorious. And Sophia was illiterate, right? But she knew the Bible.
Yeah.
Right. And she would like talk to, if anyone knows like old Black people, maybe you don't, but they all, in the Christian ones, they speak in the King's English.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
These and thous. When she starts praying, she prays like she's like 16th century, 17th century in England, right? So it's like a Southern Black accent speaking in the King James English, praying to God all of the time, quoting scripture. And so telling her story, and a lot of things happen on that land that you have to read the book to figure it out. But it means a lot. And I spent the first couple of years of my life on that land. And her story, and my grandfather, who's also a tenant farmer. So on both sides of my family, they're tenant farmers. And what it was like for him, he tells this one story about how they would get on the bus. And I don't even know if I wrote it as well as he described it, but he would pick cotton. Started at 4 years old. I can't imagine 4 years old picking cotton. He started picking cotton at 4 years old. When he finally starts elementary school, he says they get him on the colored bus. And the bus had those flaps on them that, almost looked like the buggies from back in the day. And he said they would go past the nice white school to the colored school, is what it was called. And he said there was no heat, so they would go downstairs and they would, like, I guess, put the coal in. I don't even know how any of this works, like in my brain, like coal in to heat the school.
Wow.
And he said it took the whole by the end of the day, when it was actually finally warm, it was time to go home.
Yeah.
They're either cold or hot.
Yeah.
And so just the life, the unimaginable, the fact that someone I knew, he's 86 and he's still alive. Someone that I knew picked cotton and went to a colored school where he's shoveling coal to heat it. And he sees the inferior school. And then he talks about later how he goes over to his family eventually moves, they get off the tenant farm and they move to the city. And that's this Black community that I never even knew existed. Where it was like the beginning of the Black middle class, not Black middle class, Black lower class, right? Yeah. Lower working class. And there was a colored school that was actually good. And so his family moves him there, but eventually that entire community is gone because eminent domain, they build a highway there and they wipe it out. So I didn't even know this school existed. I've driven over that highway 1,000 times. And my grandfather said, no, I used to go to, I said, Dad, there's no school there. I showed on the map. He said, no, it was right there. And I Googled it. He's right. You can go and find those pictures. Wow. And so it's like, there are these moments but nonetheless, in both of those cases, the school gets torn down and things happen to the land. But there was something beautiful in the struggle itself. Yeah. I think that's instructive about America. And the fact that community is torn down and things happen with the land that my grandmother, great-grandmother bought, isn't their failures. Yeah. It's America's failures. Yeah. That's what I mean when I say the story isn't about me. It's about, like, America. So a Black family goes from picking cotton. They finally get a community of their own, and that community is taken from them. Yeah. So that community is taken from them, literally bulldozed. Yeah. Because of course you can move the Black community, no one's going to fight it. Sure. What is that? Is that revealing something about an inadequacy in them, or what America does? I talked to my grandfather, about Brown versus Board of Education, and I asked him. I remember, like, we're on the phone. So in the book, it's a narrative, but it's on the phone. We're talking on the phone. I said, Granddad, tell me about Brown versus Board of Education. I read about it in school. And it's this huge moment where, like, everything changes. And there's the picture of the young girl who's, like, reading about it, right? And so you're thinking, like, oh, did you all celebrate? And he says, we didn't have a radio or television. I didn't know. My school didn't integrate. And if you go back and you kind of put that on the top of history, you recognize that after Brown versus Board of Education in the South, there's massive resistance, and schools shut down rather than integrate. And he never goes to an integrated school. And my mother goes to the first one in first grade. Wow. years later, right?
Yeah.
And so telling those stories were inspiring because I saw the dignity of Black life struggling against seemingly insurmountable odds. But it was also heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Because you saw the things that were in front of them that they couldn't ultimately overcome. And then I'm the heir of all of those things, right? You know, so that I make it a little bit further because of their sacrifices. But those stories are linked together. That how far to the promised land that I never get to write those stories if my grandfather's family doesn't leave the tenant farm and come into the city. That he doesn't fight to get his daughter into integrated schools. My mom doesn't push forward. And so all of those things have, I think, a melancholy beauty to them that are both inspiring and frustrating.
No, that's beautiful. And I think you do a great job at paying homage and respect to so many people throughout your family, your father in particular. I think you even dedicated your Reading While Black to him.
Yeah. So it's really funny. Like, I think that I wish sometimes you have things going on in your subconscious that you don't know about. I'm not like a big psychology person, right? So forgive me if I'm using the wrong language. But if anyone knows about my first book, Reading While Black, I'm writing Reading While Black around the time that my father dies. And it comes time, the last thing that you do when you write a book is they say, do you want to dedicate it to anyone? And I said, I want to dedicate it to my father. And the dedication, if you open up Reading While Black, on the inside cover says, this book is dedicated to my father who died before we ever got to see our name in print. Whatever else I am, I remain your son. The conclusion to How Far to the Promised Land is basically the explanation of that entry. But for years after Reading While Black came out, everyone assumed I had a positive relationship with my father. That was so sweet. I can't believe you did that. He must have been a great dad. And I would just kind of grit my teeth and nod. You know, someone sent me a message like, man, I cried when I saw that. I want to dedicate my book to my dad too. It's like, not the same. But I think that was my way of saying, even this is 5 years before the book comes out, before this book is written, I forgive you. That was my way of articulating. When I say whatever else I am, I remain your son. That was saying, despite all the other stuff that you did, our stories are inextricably, they're linked together. And I think the truth is we are linked to the people who hurt us. Our stories are connected. And especially when they're in our families. And so for me, I want it to be descriptive rather than prescriptive. Because I was blessed to have some conversations with my father. There's no Hollywood endings in life. But I was blessed to have some conversations with my father before he died. But I know other people don't. Some people have relationships with people who wound them, who never have anything that's different. One of the really interesting things about that is my children, 2 of whom are here, but I won't say anything about them. But they only met the nice version of my dad. That's when they saw him. And it's always been interesting to me, and only 2 of them are probably even old enough to remember, that's who they got to meet. And so for them, that's the only dad that they know. It's not as complicated, or granddad as they know. But for me, that dedication in this book is about me making sense of someone whose actions define my life. I know you didn't ask me this, but I'm going to answer the question anyway. What did I choose as the
eulogy text?
Eulogy text.
I was going to ask that.
There we go.
There you go.
So those people who don't know a lot about Bible stories, the story of a Pharisee and the tax collector. And in the story, the tax collector is the bad guy. And he goes to the temple and he begins to pray. And the only thing that he can say is, God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. The Pharisee is the religious person. He does everything right and he's judgmental. And Christians love this story because you can make a mess of your entire life and you can at the end say, God, I'm sorry. It's like the thief on the cross. Like last minute, boom. That's the best way to do it. You sin the whole life, get saved at the end, right? And so there's a sense in which we use that story rhetorically to say to people that you can change. But the tax collector ruined a lot of people's lives before he got converted.
Yep.
Tax collectors rob. We don't like tax collectors now, right? The IRS guy, right? Like they rob people. They steal your hard-earned money, right? And so, yeah, you might be happy that this person turned their life around.
Yeah.
But you're wrestling with the fact that before they turned their life around, they caused you real pain.
Mm.
And so for me, it was really about trying to wrestle with this idea. I wanted him to be better, but him being better doesn't undo the bad stuff that he did.
Yeah. Wow.
And how do you love someone
Yeah.
who you find it very difficult to forgive?
Yeah. I don't know if you want to go here, but talk to us about the final conversation that your father had with your mother, if you want to.
Yeah,
is that a spoiler?
No, that's not a
Okay.
spoiler. The spoiler is like the last conversation the only story that I do not tell, I refuse to tell, is a story about me and my father and our names. That's the one thing you got to read the book.
Okay,
I'll tell you everything else. But I've been waiting my whole life to tell that story.
Yeah.
My father had got it in his mind that he was going to reconcile with my mom. My mom has good sense, so she said no consistently. And so he would apologize, like, thank you, but like we're never ever getting back together, in Taylor Swift's words. And the day that he dies, he calls my mom like minutes before he dies. And he says, I'm going to win you back. And she says, whatever. And I'm going into the movie with my sister. I'll talk to you later. Hangs up the phone. She goes in to watch the movie. And before she hangs up the phone and goes, all that I can do is pray. And they hang up and he dies moments after that. And if there's anything that's like movie-like in my life, it's the fact that my father was a truck driver his entire life. And he was a runner. He ran from his family his entire life. And he would leave and he would come back. He would leave and he would come back. And he dies on the road, promising to come back. And for a long time, I genuinely thought, and I don't know why I thought this, maybe you're just a kid. You thought, well, maybe he's leaving and coming, leaving and coming, leaving and coming, because he kind of hates us. And it's some kind of weird mind game. But I realized that he was attempting to be something that he didn't know how to be. He kept coming back because he knew that his family was important, but he didn't know how to love us well. And that you talk about beauty out of pain. Even though he failed, right? There is something beautiful in the attempt, right?
Yeah.
That he saw even at the end, the beauty of life with God and his family. But like in the most tragic sense of the word, he ran out of road. And so people ask me, if he didn't die on the road like that, how far to the promised land get written? I don't know how it sounds weird. I don't know how his story could have ended any other way.
Yeah.
Wow. And maybe the book, I don't even know. Like maybe he has like yet another spiral back to where he was. I don't know. But it feels like there was something providential that he died in the midst of his last attempt.
Wow.
And there's something about, for me personally, that it teaches me like what actually matters, right? One of the things that happened for me when I was a kid, and maybe we can open up for the audience questions. When I was a kid, some people dream of being like lawyers or doctors or NFL players. I didn't really have any career aspirations. One of the weird parts about my life is that I'm actually not ambitious as it relates to my career. It's like whatever happens, happens. But what I always wanted to do was to be a husband and a father. Even before like puberty, I didn't even like girls, right? I was like, stay away from these girls, right? And like a little kid. But it was a question. It was like, you get these ideas in your head as a kid. And I always wondered, like, what would happen to a boy if his dad like loved him?
Wow.
How would that impact how he grew up and developed? And what would happen to a woman if her husband loved her and was kind instead of cruel. And so my whole life, I've only ever wanted to be a husband and a father. And that makes it really bad because when you mess up as a parent, like, oh, it's one thing I'm supposed to do. I'm bad at it. But for me, that idea of who he was and what he didn't do turned me into someone whose primary focus is his family. Because I realized there was something about him that was never at peace because he couldn't solve that part. Anyways, sorry. Should we
yeah, let's open. Anybody have questions?
Oh, wait. She's saying no questions.
Our audience
In here, yes.
You had mentioned something about,
Yes,
something about what you like to talk about was your wife. Would you tell us a little bit more about that, and also what happened with her parents?
Oh, that means I gotta leave some mystery. I can just say that I really like her, and I think that you'll like her too. Can I be opaque there? But yeah, I know you like, and you like her too. I think that one of the things that is true about love is that it's more complicated than like we might want to imagine. We have these idealistic notions of falling in love and, I don't know, building this wonderful life together, and everybody gets what they want. But love is a bit of a car wreck, a collision, where like these two dreams and ideas bump up against reality. And each of you has to let go of a little bit of what they wanted, but maintain left of themselves for the thing to work, right? And so the process of figuring out, building that life together, out of those collisions of dreams, where each person's dignity and personhood is respected, and you deal with the complicated nature of love. One of the things I say, I like writing about it, but I don't like talking about it. And so like one of the interesting things about like when you sit down to write something, it's like sometimes as a writer, maybe the writer's in the room, it's the only time you feel like you're in control and that you can tell the truth. People always tell you what you ought to do and what you ought to be. But when you sit down, it's like a chance line. This is my part, nobody else speak. And so when I have the pen, like everybody has to be quiet and I can tell the story. And I can tell the story in a way that I am compelled by honesty, not anyone else's expectation of me. And being able to tell that story was something, that was the first time that I've spoken about our relationship extensively. And it may be the last time. I had to sit down with my wife and I had to sit down with my in-laws and say, can I tell this story? And they were kind enough to allow me to do it. Oh, thank you. That's a recommendation. She said it's good. Are there any other questions? Oh, here we go. Go ahead.
The story that your mother taught you, thus talk.
Oh, yes.
Thus talk.
Yeah, one of the things that we didn't get as much into that in this part. I talked about the family story that marks a lot of how far to the promised land. But it's also a chronicle of anti-Black racism in the South. And the reason those two things may seem to be completely disparate, but they're actually woven together, because trauma doesn't like take turns, right? It doesn't say on Monday, you're going to deal with your family, on Tuesday, I'll be racist, and on Wednesday, you'll be poor, right? Those three things happen on top of each other all at the same time. And so I'm not spending my entire life thinking about, oh, how do I make sense of my dad? Sometimes I'm getting pulled over by the police. And in all of those conversations, I'm trying to answer the question of where's God is in the midst of it. And one of the things that happens is people can argue with you about the existence of racism in America. But it's really hard to argue with someone who carries this Black body around the South, right? I try to explain this to young people. And I say, what you all think of as George Floyd, we had something similar with Rodney King. but like, it was like, I tried to explain to him like a big video camera. It's like, it was like a cell phone with no internet, with like an external hard drive that you put stuff in. Like and the idea that like someone would have something like that where that would be videotaped. Now we just assume that everything that happens, you can see it. But the chances of videotaping anything during that period of time was relatively rare. And so what happened with George Floyd and the host of events that we kind of see, we're almost numb to it. For the Rodney King incident was like this particular instance of, see, we told you about this. And it kind of, one of the things, and I hope this isn't me rambling, but it's really important to understand how these events work. Because what happens is when someone sees a racial event, what they want to do is analyze that particular event and have an argument about it. What they don't realize is what that racial event does is it triggers an entire group. They're not just seeing Rodney King or George Floyd, they're remembering their own incidents and the things that happen in their community, right? And one of the tricky things is no one incident can actually bear that weight. That no one racial incident can actually stand in for all the things you experience. So like, but that's what, and so when that happens, my mom sits down with me and she tells me about how do you, I was like 12, 13, I couldn't even drive, right? This is how you handle, being pulled over by police. I remember she telling me, don't go to these 3 or 4 cities. These cities are nowhere near me. Like, I've never been that. And it's the interesting part about this. I go back and I look this up years later. 2 of the cities she told me, don't go to Coleman and don't go to Arab City. Now go up and look in Arab. That's the name of the place. And I go years later, decades later, and I Google these places. Mom told me never to go to, never went to them. Sorry if this is your city, this is life, right? And those cities were sundown towns where Black people were not allowed to be after sundown from back as far as they were founded. And the stories of you not going there had gone from grandparent to parent to child. One of the times my mom told me, like one of the other rules my mom told me was to get gas and fill your gas tank up before you go and just like, don't stop. And one time I was coming back from Mississippi, and teenagers never listen to what their parents tell them. I don't like, we're teenagers. We can survive everything, right? And so I didn't do it, and I'm running low on gas. And I said, she said, don't do this. Don't just take random exits. I'm somewhere between Mississippi and Alabama, see an exit, says gas, I go to it. Middle of the day. And I pull into the gas station, and I walk in, and the conversation just stops. I'm like the only Black guy in there. And nobody's like, oh, it's great to have a person integrate this gas station, right? And it was one of those gas stations where like it's like a grill / gas station. So like there's a bunch of people in the gas station eating bad hot dogs, right? And they were just not happy to see me. And I remember thinking immediately, this is a bad idea. So I just said, give me like 20 on 4. I just handed the 20. He said, just give me some gas. And I just walked out. And it's like one of those, sorry, the reason I had to go in is that it was like the gas station didn't have a card swipe. You got to go in. It's old school. I had to go in and talk to the person. And so I'm filling up the gas thing. And guys start coming out of the station. Guess they had finished their hot dogs. And they get into the trucks with the Confederate flag or something and everything. And I'm like, okay, I got enough gas to like, I just cut it. I think I put in $15 instead of the 20 or whatever. And I remember just getting in the car. And when I pulled off, they pulled off. And they fought. And by the way, this is back in the day, there's no GPS. You just hoping for a sign that says back to the interstate. And they followed me all the way until I got to the interstate. I took the exit, and then they let me go. And that was one of those times where I talk about it. It's like when you are Black and in the South, there's no warning, right? You can just make a mistake. You don't listen to your mom when you take an exit. And like, what happens if I stay? What happens? Like, there's 15 things. There's another time when I'm heading to a party. Just like kids, we go to parties, man. I'm heading to a party. And I see some friends of mine at the gas station heading towards Madison Square Mall. If you ever go to Huntsville, there's parts of it that's still there, main highway. And I see some friends, and we go in, and I'm getting some gas again. And we just talk, hey, man, don't go to this party, go to that party like you used to do back in the day. Well, you don't know, you're a young person. Before there was Facebook, you just had to word on the street. You had to figure out, where's the party? It's here. How do you get there? You draw it on a sheet of paper. You just listen for the music. That's how you get to the party. And so you would go to the mall, hope to find somebody who knew where the party was. That's like the plan. Friday, we go to the mall, we'll figure it out from there. So like he had told us about what the party was. We get ready to leave. And these SUVs come from us in the back and they come from the front on the side. And I'm thinking I'm getting carjacked. But I'm thinking, I got like a hoopty, so why are you carjacking me? And like, I'm not going to fight you. Like, they're like, that's an organized carjacking with 3 black SUVs. People pour out with the police, undercover cops. It's a sting operation. This is a well-known drug spot. I'm getting gas under the light. I'm thinking to myself, this is a well-known spot to get gas. But you can't say that, right? Because your life, and I never forget, I'm sitting in the car. My friend next to me is named Karan. This part isn't in the book. This is free. Karan is sitting next to me. And they said, maybe I put this in, I don't remember. And he said, put your hands up, get out of the car. And Karan's like, we ain't getting out of the car. And my life flashed before my eyes in that moment. Because like Karan, he's about that life. He's like, I don't care. I said, no, officer, we getting out the car. And I remember thinking, we get out of the car, they strip the entire thing bare, they take everything out of the trunk, they don't find anything. They just pull off. They just leave. They don't put anything back. No apologies. No nothing. But I remember in that moment thinking, you know, a couple of sentences go wrong in that moment where Karan is mad because he's innocent. And that could have been the end of it. And so maybe even the reason why I am sometimes overly nervous as a parent, it's because the stakes in the South were always so high. And you couldn't just do something like have an attitude one day. And so when you talk about what is it like growing up in the South, it is unexpected racial incidents that emerge out of the ordinary. You're going to a party, you're getting gas, you're at a mall, shopping, you're driving home to see your family, you're going to a basketball game. And so this reality that there is no like warning, there's no warning. And the ability in the moment to think big, because you're not asking the question of what is legal, you're asking the question of what is survivable. And the reality is all you need, this is what happens in these incidents all of the time, all you need is two people to have a bad day at the same time. The person and the police officer, right? And I've been blessed that in most of those circumstances, I wasn't having a bad day when he was having a bad day. And I was afraid that what happens if those bad days coincided. And that's what the reason that chapter is called Flee in the South, is because I didn't know if I would always be wise. We got time for like another question or two.
Any last questions before we end?
Yes.
Oh.
Sarah, sorry.
I'm sorry to ask this question, actually, and feel free not to answer it. But you've talked about it in the South, but we know it's elsewhere in our country too. I mean, even in our area here.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you'd rather not talk about that, that's awesome.
Oh, well, it's funny.
I'm sorry to do that.
No, it's okay. Like maybe, I sent an article in to my editor. I don't know if they're actually going to publish it. The New York Times has it called Black Professors, White Neighborhoods. And so I talk about like the complicated nature of being in spaces like this. They have it, they asked for it, but so if you all see it, I still love y'all. But anyways, I got to tell the truth. So I would say There is can I give you an analogy? So one of the other articles I'm working on is on climate change. And one of the things that's true about climate change is that the wealthy tend to be the ones who are most verbally like aggressive about, we need to fix the environment, blah, blah, blah. You can imagine all the people who do it. But the truth is that the top 10% of earners do something like 50 to 60% of the climate activity in the United States. In other words, the rich in America are responsible for more pollution than the poor. And you say something like places that are the most liberal, San Francisco, Portland, other places, Wheaton, right? Parts of Wheaton are also the ones that are least affordable for the poor to actually stay there. And that anytime someone tries to put up low rent housing in San Francisco or New York, there's a riot. So there's a distinction between what we say and the politics we hold and what we actually do in our lives. And so when you come to places like the Midwest or the Northeast, blue places, not red places, you get more articulation of justice concerns, but similar kinds of underlying hypocrisy. Is that a good word? Diplomatic word? And one of the things that you always have to ask is, and maybe this is just like, it's easy to actually put up a sign, right? You can put up a sign and put it in your neighborhood and say, look, I got the sign. I believe the stuff, right? I believe all the stuff. But then I ask, well, like, how is that sign actually helping a Black person? Right? And what kinds of policies are put into place that actually allow for thriving, right? One of the things is really, and I don't want to like go too far down this road, but you shouldn't ask me questions. I have to tell the truth. You're gonna drive around, right? And there's different parts of the city, even this city, or you can drive to the next town over, right? And so I think that it is true, and this is unique to me. Some other African Americans have had different experiences in Wheaton than I have. I've not had any like racial incidents since I've been here. Well, that's not true. I never had, like, I've had some the core level ones with like, that's just being Black in America, but like nothing that rises to narrative level. But the idea of there is a sense in which the idea, because we believe the right things, we have accomplished, we've done all that is required of us. And I want to say, one of the things that How Far to the Promised Land is attempting to do is to shape the moral imagination of people. In other words, when you live in places like this, there's people who you don't see, right? You don't see them. They're just like ideas and they flash across the news. And the question becomes, what happens when you get a pen, when you get a chance to tell your own story, right? And what I decided when I had the chance to tell my own story was, I was not simply going to tell the story of me accomplishing these great deeds and such that I arrived in this glorious place. I wanted to say, no, 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 no. For the 200 pages that you are in this book, you're going to see the people that I see, and you're going to care about the people that I care about. And then you're going to ask yourself, am I comfortable with a country that does this to people? Because I am convinced that we lack the moral imagination to really bring about change. And as a writer, all that I can do is try to shape the moral imagination of the readers. And because if you can imagine a different world, then you can begin to construct it. And so what I tried to do there was show people a world that they might not see, so that they care. And because I can't forget these people, they stick with me forever. I can't let loose of them. I hope the reader can't let loose of them. So now you know my grandmother too. And what are you going to do about what America did to her? And so that was probably what I was up to. Thank you for asking me that question.
Okay. Any other last minute questions? Okay, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being here tonight. Esau,
And
thank you.
I'm gonna stay here. I'm gonna stay here and sign
Yep.
these things. I'll be happy to sign.
Yes, please come up and buy a book and have it signed. Thank you.